Welcome to the Stories Behind the Songs with Dave Kittle. Back in 1979, Dave began a radio career at CHEZ 106 in Ottawa, which spanned 17 years. He was one of the on-air voices that I grew up listening to, and he introduced me to new music that literally changed my life. His knowledge and passion for music are inspiring, to say the least. And in this 6-part podcast, Dave and I sit down and discuss the British invasion.
They had already failed an audition with Decca Records, probably the biggest record company in the UK. They had failed an audition. The famous line by the head of Decca, Dick Rowe, was telling Brian Epstein, their manager at the time, "I'm sorry, Mr. Epstein, but guitar groups are on their way out." That was his famous line to Brian Epstein. Yeah, and that's why he turned the Beatles down. And that's the big reason why the Rolling Stones got signed to Decca, is because the Decca knew that they couldn't make the same mistake twice.
Right.
So they signed the Rolling Stones in, 63, a year later.
Holy crap. What a mistake that was for them.
They could have had the Beatles. And they were turned down by every record label in the UK.
Yeah.
And Parlophone was a small... it was a small label with EMI, which was the big company. Decca, Columbia, EMI right, in UK were the big companies. And Parlophone was a small label that concentrated most on comedy records.
Oh, did they?
Yeah. Like the Goon Show, which was Peter Sellers and Spike Milligan, which George Martin produced. And one of the reasons why he and the Beatles got along so well is they were both fans of the Goons, British humor back in the day. They were on Parlophone, and George Martin produced them.
Oh.
And I didn't know. They were a comedy label. Well, they had a little bit, but people like Matt Monro and middle of the road singers, these type of people. Matt Monro was like a sort of a. I'm trying to think of off the top of my head somebody who would be. Comparable. He was like a Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, crooner type.
Okay, yeah.
Nowhere near as popular as them, but he was he had some hits. But this was the kind of stuff that Parlophone was releasing back in the day.
Okay.
The British acts at the time, Cliff Richards and the Shadows, and these other bands, Johnny Kidd and the Pirates, they were all on other major labels.
Right.
But Parlophone was a small little.
Like
subsidiary label with EMI,
and
George Martin was the head of that, and he basically lucked into them.
I mean, when he obviously saw, like you said, the personalities of them, but he must have had an inkling that these guys, there was something about these guys.
He noticed that there was some talent, but the stuff that they were doing when he first heard them was pretty crude. Was pretty crude stuff. Yeah. They were starting to write their own material, but they were very raw. And he saw some talent there, but it was their personalities. If they wouldn't have had the personalities they have, he probably would not have signed them.
Okay.
He probably would not have signed them.
By the time George Martin saw them, now you were going to talk about how hard they worked. Right?
Prior to that. Oh, yeah.
And not a lot of people, I didn't know that they had worked so hard just to get there. Because by the time we saw them, they were a finished product.
Pretty much.
They were polished.
Oh, yeah.
But take us back to the...
Well, when they started in the late 50s, McCartney and Lennon met in, 57? Was it 57 or 56? I'm going to say 57, 56, 57, when they met at that church gathering in Liverpool, when John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, were playing there on the back of a flatbed truck, and McCartney and him met.
Yeah.
They played the usual circuit in Liverpool at the time. They played, dances and stuff like that, and then they started. Then they hooked up with a local guy named Alan Williams, who was a local club owner / manager / deal maker kind of guy. Okay. He was entertainment. He's doing all kinds of different things. He sent them to Hamburg. He had gone to Hamburg with a tape that he had made of the Beatles, a very, very crude tape, to try to get them some work in the strip clubs in Hamburg, because there was another Liverpool band had gone over there and had come back and told him that there was work over there for bands, and he was managing the Beatles at the time.
Okay.
Kind of managing them. And so he went over there to try to get them some work, and the tape screwed up. And he was not able to let the club owner hear what they sounded like. So he wasn't able to get them a gig in Hamburg. But it just so happened that he met the same guy, this guy Bruno Korschmeider, in London a short while later, and convinced him to book the Beatles into one of his clubs in Hamburg, which he did. So the Beatles went over there, John, Paul, George, Stu Sutcliffe, the late Stu Sutcliffe, on bass, and Pete Best on drums. But Pete Best wasn't in the band at the time. They needed a drummer to go over there. Okay. So they found Pete Best. He was his mother ran a club out of her house called the Casbah Club that they played in occasionally.
Oh, okay.
And so he played the drums. So they asked him if he wanted to come. So he did. So he was their drummer. So they went to Hamburg. I believe this would have been about 1960, I think, 59 or 60. And they played a little strip club called the Bambi Kino. And they backed a stripper. And then they played in this club. And they played 8 hours a night, 7 days a week.
8 hours a night?
Pretty much.
7 days a week
pretty
for
much.
How long?
Well, I think they probably played there for 6 months.
My God!
And then they played. They started there. Then they moved up to a better club called the Indica. I think the Indica Club, which was also this Bruno Kirschmeider owned. Okay, a little bit bigger club because they were doing better. Yeah, they were getting more polished. Because they were playing so much. They were learning all this stuff, and then they they were deported because George Harrison was underage. Actually, they were deported because they were moonlighting at another club in Hamburg, and this Bruno Kirschmeider found out about it and had them deported.
Oh, jeez.
So, and it turned out that George Harrison was underage anyway, so they came back to Liverpool. Okay. And then they were, after 6 months of playing in Hamburg, 8 hours a night, 7 days a week, they were much better, and they started getting much better gigs in Liverpool. Right. Yeah. And then Stu Sutcliffe, the bassist, stayed in, because he wasn't much of a bass player. Okay. He was an art school friend of John Lennon's, very, very good artist, who I think won 60 pounds or something in an art exhibition, and was talked into buying a bass guitar and joining the band by the rest of the guys, even though he couldn't play a note, but he looked good. He was a very cool looking guy. Okay. And John wanted him in the band because he was his art school friend. Right. And Stu decided to stay in Hamburg because he had fallen in love with a girl named Astrid Kirchner, who was a very, very early fan of the Beatles. Okay. Discovered them through her boyfriend Klaus Wurman, who remained a lifelong friend of the Beatles right through, designed the Revolver album cover and played bass on a lot of later Beatles solo stuff. Klaus was the first guy to discover them. He and Astrid were boyfriend-girlfriend at the time, and they had a fight one night, and he wandered off down to the Reeperbahn in Hamburg, which is where the strip clubs were, where the Beatles were playing, and was walking by this club one night and heard the sound coming inside and went in and saw them and went back and told Astrid, and then they and all their friends started to befriend them. Wow. And that's where Astrid and Stu Sutcliffe met and fell in love. So he decided to stay in Hamburg to pursue an art career. So he left the band. Okay. Yeah, so the next time they came over 6 or 8 months later, they were a 4-piece band. Paul was now on bass, John and George on guitars, Pete Best on drums, and they came back and played a little bit better club the next time. Right. But it was the same thing. 8 hours a night, 7 days a week, drunken sailors, fights, bottles being thrown across the bar, crates of cheap champagne being set up on stage to play songs. So they were out of control. They were just completely wild. They discovered pep pills called Prellies. Okay. Pregilin, which was a pep pill that was sold behind the bar at these clubs, and they would take these things to give them the energy to play 8 hours a night.
Yeah, 8 hours, that's ridiculous.
It is. Yeah, that's crazy. And then they did this for a while, and then they left and came back to Liverpool and were better and played better gigs. I believe Brian Epstein had discovered them around this time, because I believe it was in their second trip to Liverpool, to Hamburg, that they made a recording with Tony Sheridan, backing guy Tony Sheridan, who was another English rocker based in Hamburg, playing the same circuit that they were playing, who got a record deal.
You've been listening to The Stories Behind the Songs with Dave Kittle. Join us again next week for the continuation of this podcast, brought to you by Sunholes Music. Download the latest album now at sunholes.com.